welcome to Film Prize University again. I'm Rob Senska, and tonight we'll be going over post-production. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about our sponsors. Film Prize University is presented by the Film Prize Foundation, made possible by a generous grant from Louisiana Entertainment, which is a division of Louisiana Economic Development, supported by our partners at the Louisiana Film Entertainment Association, and so many other sponsors for Film Prize. All those people that make Film Prize possible and amazing, and it keeps getting better every year. If you don't know what Film Prize is, real briefly, you make a short film between 5 and 15 minutes, submit it, right now it's 2022, submit it by July 12th. It can be a rough cut, as rough or complete as you want it to be. And then in August, the top 20 are chosen. And in October, there's a film festival, and those 20 films are shown. And if you shot in Caddo Parish or the Shreveport area, a parish is a county for those of you around the country, you're eligible for $50,000 if you're the best film. If you shoot anywhere in Louisiana besides Caddo Parish, you're eligible for $25,000. So not a bad deal. And then there's also grants given out to some of the filmmakers that the judges feel need another chance at making a film. So tonight we're talking to Stephen here. He's a professional editor who I've found fascinating. He cut his teeth on the editing room in Fantastic Four in Baton Rouge. And he's been working on tons of films, whether that's documentary or scripted. His films have gone to festivals. He's cut some movies with some pretty cool people. If you look at his IMDb afterwards, I'm really jealous he's got to work with those people sort of through the screen. But tonight he's going over post-production, which is pretty much what you do with your footage once you have wrapped on set. What do you do with all this stuff? He'll talk a little bit about software, but mainly about the technique, because not all of you will have the same software. So don't get intimidated by what he's going to show up on screen. It's mainly about the basics. It's like a camera. Every camera is kind of the same if you know what the buttons do. The buttons are just in different places. So that being said, Stephen, take it away.
Thanks for inviting me to come speak for Film Prize. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's definitely a massive topic, and this talk is only going to be about an hour long, so not really going to be able to get into deep specifics on things, but I'm very happy to stay outside of the technical realm as much as I can and stay more philosophical, theoretical, and speak more about just approach. Rob mentioned this is post-production. It's what you do with your footage after you've shot. On the projects that I like to work on, to me, post-production actually starts in pre-production. I'm a picture editor, so I like to come on during pre-production and work with the director, the DP, the producers during pre-production a little bit, but also while they're shooting, if you can possibly do that, and help transition it into pure editorial and post-production time. But it gets the name post-production just because it's really the bulk of it happens after the big, expensive hoopla of set. But to me, editorial is the junction point of the film in many ways. Not that it's more important, but that in the process of making your film, you start with your script, and it's like a pure idea in a way when it's a script. And as it goes through production, you have to explode it into a billion different pieces in order to make it happen. And editorial in post-production is the moment that you start putting it back together in the way that, initially in the way that you intended in the script, and eventually it'll become its own new thing. But editorial is that reunification of everything. And in that way, editorial department is going to be like an accountability department for all the other departments. In that, yeah, you can get into the technicalities of editing, as far as cutting goes, and cutting footage and how many frames this, how many frames that. But at a deep level, you are the department that other departments need to be able to rely on, that you are going to put their best foot forward, that an actor can trust you, that you are going to put their best performance on screen. You're going to show the best camera moves and the best lighting and the best representation of what the director wants. And it even goes downstream whenever you start getting music and sound and color and all these other elements that like they're handing it back to you and you're going to be the one that can help them know, or visual effects, you're going to be the one to help them know whether or not it works in the film. That's kind of how I view it, kind of in a big perspective, is like, yeah, it's cutting, it's editing in that sense, but like as a member of the team, like you are the department of accountability. And you'll make mistakes, of course. Like I am by far from perfect. I am just very stubborn, and I'll stick it out. And I admit my mistakes as soon as I notice them, and just find out what it was, let people know right away so that the mistake doesn't perpetuate. Because the worst thing you can have happen in editorial is not calling out a mistake, or not calling out something that's going to be a problem, because it's always going to be a problem later, and it most likely will be your problem again if you don't fix it as soon as you catch it. What is an editor in the production? I mean, so it's very classically like the person who's actually just cutting things. So in my role on a film, I'm the one who's actually going to be cutting footage, sound, audio into a timeline. No one else is really going to be cutting anything into like the timeline. Not that it's like a hands-off thing, but and there could be very collaborative environments where the director is cutting as well, or the director is editing. But really just traditionally, like that title just means like the person that's cutting things in. And they're going to be sound effects editors, music editors, visual effects editors, ADR editors. Those are just people in those departments that are cutting things in to the timeline. My plan is to hope for the best, plan for the worst. And that starts at the very first step in preparing for a project. So whenever I prepare for a new project, whenever I get a new project, if I'm lucky enough to start something new and exciting, it obviously starts with conversations with the director, because even if you're hired by the producer, like really you're working for the director, and that's really how it should be. You're their left hand, and you're kind of like going to be on the sidelines helping them throughout the entire process from then on out in the post-production realm. But you'll start with conversations with the director to make sure that you all are on the same page, creatively and inspiration-wise. And before you even start cutting, or before they start shooting, like going and watching reference videos that they might recommend, or doing additional research into the topic, I find is always beneficial. The last couple of feature films I've worked on, the director will like arrive with like a stack of books for like literal homework for me to do. And even if like none of that ever ends up on screen, like it's in there, it's in your brain, because you're an additional brain for the director to bounce ideas off of. But when you're still in the preparation stage, conversation with the director, read the script. Obviously, breaking down the script is really an important step, where you kind of, everybody breaks down the script in every department in their own particular way. But you're kind of going to be one of the last departments to do it, because after it's cut, the script doesn't matter all that. Not that it doesn't matter, but the film's no longer the script. The film is now the film. So you're kind of like the last department to break it down. But I have like a whole database system that you could do in Google Drive, essentially, or some sort of spreadsheet, where you just break down the script into different scenes and make notes of all the things you might be concerned about, or things that might slip through, or sound effects that you might need, or music that you might want to pull, stock footage, any of those kinds of things. And you can start pulling those early on. And that just like helps you kind of like emulsify and break down the big picture into something a little more digestible and small, so that by the time you start getting footage in, you can like reference this database. Other things I like to do early on in a project is I like to reach out to every other department head in production to make sure we're all on the same page as far as like the technical details, whether that be frames per second, the aspect ratio, what cameras they're shooting on, like all those little decisions are important for editorial to know and important for everybody to be on the same page. And on a small project, it's kind of, everybody wears a lot of hats, and at least on the ones that I've been involved in, like editorial really needs to step up and make sure that like sound department, camera department are talking to each other.
And just to explain a little bit of that, if some people are recording audio to their cameras, some people are doing it second system, as we call it, where it's being recorded separately and you have to sync that. And if the frame rates don't sync up, then you're going to notice that the lips don't quite sync up, for those of you that are just starting out in this process. And we can also, while we're talking about the ingestion of footage, mention how it's so important to mark your shots, because having that slate in the frame, maybe not it's as important for a short, but let's say you've shot 3 days and you don't have anything marked. You think you know what the shots are, but then you get into the editing room maybe a week later and it's just like, where does this go? So how important is set organization to you, Stephen, once you have footage on the coming into the computer?
Oh yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I feel like I could almost talk for an hour about slating alone. It's really like, it's the kind of thing like being an external editor, and that's kind of how I refer to it on smaller projects, because the way it is in a lot of like smaller markets, New Orleans being kind of like I don't even know how big of a market New Orleans is, but there's a lot of like filmmaker, like director editors, and there's not a lot of like external editors. And what I mean by that is like someone like myself who's like not directing and like sitting behind the computer, handling stuff on their own. Much more, it's like the traditional system on the big stuff. But when you have an external editor who's not on set, like I know nothing. Like I don't know any of those decisions that are being made on the fly on set day of. And it's things that like, oh, sure, it'll make sense later once it's explained to me. But unless there's like breadcrumbs and like even like the simplest like notes to let me know like, oh, we didn't do this, we did this instead. Like, so slating, making sure you get that clap in like in a clean way is like mission critical. But in addition to slating, like I'd recommend, I mean, if you want to make your editor happy, like camera notes, sound reports, and a script supervisor, all keeping track of what's being shot, like what the shot name is, all those things, because then I can triangulate the data when it gets to me. Because inevitably somebody's gonna like be too busy to jot something down, but I'm gonna have a clip that's like, is this B-roll or is this junk, or am I missing something? You know, that's the nightmare, is like you're missing something. And you
might think you're missing something and you're scrubbing through trying to find it, but it's something that they forgot and came back to you later, but it should be there. Or if they come back and say like, let's do that take again, and there's like a take 6 down the road, but take 1 through 5 are back here. Yeah, just having some guiding system, even if the most that you guys can do making a short film and with a tiny crew is just to have somebody like say what the best take was. That way, when you're editing, you don't have to watch 6 takes of like a 1-minute shot. You can just go right to that best take. And then eventually down the road, if you want to replace something, you can kind of go back through the takes and pick your best moments.
Yeah, so I will add a little to that on the circle or selects. As an editor, I watch everything, especially on a short where there's not as much footage. But having selects, to me, like is super beneficial for one, like if you need to build a scene fast, exactly what you're saying. 2, like it lets you know like, oh, the director's going for this, because it's often the last take, but it's not always the last take. But I definitely always watch everything. Sometimes I'll watch things in reverse order for a scene. For like if the select is the last take, I'll watch that one first and then watch them. Kind of like you can see the production and performances like de-evolve in a way. So you don't like watch take one and like you fall in love with how cool everything is, and then like by the time you get to take 7 or 8, like you're desensitized to it, you can fall in love with it as the director intended. And then if like anything like you were saying, like if you want to replace something later, like if you happen to see something good in take 2, you'll know what it's trying to be. But yeah, absolutely. Like, and it's funny because we're kind of spending a lot of time talking about like production stuff, but again, to me, like editorial and post, like it starts really early, and there's so much stuff that happens on set that like if you didn't have post production, you wouldn't have to do it all, you know. And
That's
it's
a
like,
good point. It's actually stuff we hadn't really covered in the last workshop, how everything, what you do on set is so important to what you're doing offset. So I think we've probably covered enough of that little branch. So let's say what happens, you've got, unless you have more on that, let's talk about what happens when you've transferred your cards to a hard drive and you're going to put it into software. Let's just talk about how important organization is, because you might think you're organized, but imagine if you have to hand off this project to somebody with no context, with no notes, and what do you do? So talk a little bit about that.
yeah, no, that's great. So to me, like the guiding principles there are one, contain the chaos. Really, it has been like a mantra that I've had to tell myself every morning on these documentaries I've been working on, because it's like, you know, short films are chaos and like documentaries are entirely other set of chaos. But I think it really encapsulates the mission. And like you're saying, like with organization, you need to come up with some sort of like naming system that's consistent and sorts well. So like a big thing for me is like the way I write dates for things, like a shoot day, and then I'll have like day 001, so I have like 3 significant digits, and then an underscore, and I'll do like year, month, day. And I always write my dates like that because it sorts. And that to me, that's just like an example of like, you want things to be able to be consistent. And so like, you're not like changing punctuation or like hyphens or capitalization within it. And it's just so that like, it makes sure that you're doing it the way you want to be doing it, and also shows other people that you're paying attention. If I get a hard drive from someone and it's like 4 days of footage, and each day folder is named differently, or like with a slightly different system, it sends a shiver down my spine, because it tells me that like they're not paying attention to what they're doing. And like everything might be fine, but also it's usually not, you know, like there's usually something in there that's like, it's gonna be scary. So, and this stage of it's very much like the DIT or an assistant editor, or on low budget projects, which is usually what I'm working on. It's a position that's actually like kind of been dissolved, and a responsibility that like nobody really has anymore, because everyone, productions and budgets are trying to like squeeze things to the point where like this might, you know, like second ACs are trying to do this job, or being forced to do this job rather. And it's like, it's really scary, because it's like really at the end of the day, like that's the money, is like a hard drive that holds all the camera negatives, you know? So anyways, so with organization, there's many ways to do it well. And I think most importantly, that you're consistent, and with you're not renaming original camera files. I only have like one exception to that, but if you're going to like want to add like scene take names, like never rename your camera negative, because that's going to cause problems down the line with like relinking. But with your folders, like you just want a really consistent nomenclature that is like just solid.
Right, because there's also, you could be so organized, but then you go out and you have to do a few more shots like weeks later. Like if you get and this is almost any project, you get it cut and you're like, oh wow, we really need a shot of this because we didn't see the insert, or we didn't see them, or we didn't hear that line, so we have to put in a new line or something like that. So you bring that in back into the project, and you have to be able to put that someplace where it's going to make sense. You know, working on projects too, you might come back to something a year later for some reason, and your brain works in a different way and you have no idea what anything is. So yeah, as long as everything's clearly labeled. Maybe this is a good opportunity to do some screen sharing and just kind of show, like, it's kind of blow some people's minds with what the project you pulled up earlier looks like, and maybe show a little bit of organization and also what a big timeline looks like, and just kind of what each element is in the simplest way possible.
Yeah, great. All right, everybody. So I edit in Avid Media Composer. Cue a big long discussion about which NLE is best and whatever. This is one that I transitioned from Final Cut Pro 7 to Avid, and I'm happy. So this is a short film called Plumtown. I do want to point out that I did reach out to the director and ask for permission to share this project, because one of my big principles in editorial is very much secrecy and confidence, that people, they need to be able to trust you to hold the secrets of the film tight. So this is not just like me willy-nilly opening up a project. So depending on which editing software you're using, you'll be familiar with a couple of these areas. The big colorful area down here is going to be my timeline. This is a finished Final Cut. It looks nothing like that for a very long time. But I'm going to jump to some organizational stuff real quick. So like real early on in the process, you can see over here on the left is my project window, and it's organized by kind of phases. It's an organization that really only makes sense like within the editing software, but you'll see I'll have like my full cut folder, which has my bin for this one timeline. I have a workshop folder where I'll make a little day bin for every day that I'm working, in case like I wanted to make something just kind of real quick and dirty. I have an archive.
It is kind of hard to see. So maybe if you're just like, you have folders for this, and this, just so people know like what categories to put things under.
Yeah. So then I have an archive of all my sequences. I have a collection of all the scenes. I have a separate folder that I just call to be cut, which makes it literally just like a list of scenes that like are new and fresh and I haven't touched them yet, but so they don't get mixed in with all the others. It's useful, especially whenever you have like a bigger project or you have stuff constantly coming in and like you need a way to not miss something. But then I have like music, sound effects, visual effects. But then I'll have one separate for just like kind of my negative footage or my raw dailies. So this is probably also a little hard to see. But as you can see, this is my day one bin, and it's basically like a sprint sheet. It's the way that it's represented in Avid. And this is like all my metadata for this shoot day. It's going to be your frame rate.
It looks intimidating if you're new to this, but you can, if you're importing everything from the same camera, generally that's all going to be the same. So you're kind of just concerned with whatever the clip name is called.
Right. So it's intimidating in a lot of ways, but it's also in a way like it's more accessible because the information's there. There's kind of like three main pieces of metadata that are the most important. And it's for relinking down the road. You want to have your tape name, or sometimes called reel name or source file name. And you want that to be unique. And then you're going to have your source time code. And sometimes with certain pieces, you'll have like a clip name that needs to be different, like with audio. But so those are the three, but really the two most important are your like source file name and your time code, so that you want each frame of your film to have a unique combination of source name and source time code. Because if it has a unique combination, then it knows what it is and it can relink to other things later. Because I mean, I work in, and this might be a little too in the weeds, but what's called like an offline proxy workflow. So I'm not editing like the big 4K log files that have all the color information and have all like the deep information. I'm editing something that's like compressed and crunched down for speed. So my computer doesn't have to like chew through an 8K DPX file every time
That's a
I'm
good point. A
playing.
lot of people, if you're just shooting 4K because your camera can, you have to make sure your computer can handle it. And I do have a question here from
Yeah.
Julie.
My question, oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
My question is, does it do it automatically? So you're saying that all goes into one file and processes. Does it do it automatically? Do you have to do that yourself?
Great question. It's kind of a mix of automatically, some like semi-automatically and manual. The source name and the time code is going to be automatic. I use a program called DaVinci Resolve to make my offline proxies. And there's a setting in there, and there's some great tutorials online on how I'd like to set it to where it sets of the real name. And then depending on your camera, some of it will be stored in like a separate camera file, but maybe like it's called an ALE, and that you can drag in and merge with the clips. And then I have like my individual names from the slate and like shot descriptions that are definitely manual.
Well, and I think the basic version of this too is like, if you have your card and you drop it onto your computer, the names of the files are, unless you've customized it within your camera, will be just generated by the camera. So
Yeah.
Your main concern is just not having two files that are named the same thing.
Right.
Which should never be a concern unless you're specifically doing that in the camera. So if your clip comes out and it's called like 2576 whatever, that's okay as long as you know what it is and you can relabel it later. Am I right, Stephen?
Yeah. I mean, you'll see the main instances where you'll see clips that like are named the same. You'll run into that, or like GoPros, drones, anything that like is shooting in kind of a more it's called tapeless media, and it'll often come in as like C001, C002. And in that instance, I would go through and like you can do like a batch rename, and I would just give it like card 1 and then underscore C001, and then the next one I would do card 2 for like the next full batch, so you'd have a unique name or something like that. But yeah, Julie, this whole step is kind of in the realm of like the assistant editor. On a short film, I don't typically have an assistant editor, but I'll spend some time like putting in this information. Sometimes I'll go real overboard and make a lot of notes on like what the slate's doing. I'll like copy and paste what the script supervisor wrote, and I'll try to put like everything into the editing software. Or if your software doesn't have this kind of customization, like a separate just Google Sheet or Excel document or something like that, just so you have like, and really it's kind of an interesting thing where like it feels like a lot of wasted time, and sometimes it is, but in the event of a problem, you can pivot and you can access this information later, or you might forget, like these projects, obviously you're trying to get them done by well before the end of the summer. But in a more long form project, you'll forget stuff by the end of it, of like, oh, like what LUT did they burn in on the footage? But you can have it documented here. So.
And so to pull it back to like, if this is your first time doing it, like just to have at the very least, here's a folder for footage. Each of your cards has a folder. Your music has a folder. Sound effects has a folder, just so it's all, you don't just have a folder that has all of these files. It can get really crazy as your project gets bigger. And also to that note, I know something that beginners do, which I'm guilty of it, 20 years ago, is importing like, let's say you have a really cool song and you import it into your editing software, but you haven't like dragged that actual file on your computer to the hard drive you're editing. Let's say you take that hard drive to someone else to work on your movie. Your editing software can't find that song because it's on your desktop at home. So make sure all of your media that you need for your project is all coming from the same hard drive. I can't stress that enough. That's like rule number 1 before you get started editing anything.
And even if it's stuff like, yeah, that's a great note. Because like, even if it's stuff that you don't think, you're like, oh, I won't necessarily use this. just throw it on there anyway, because like you might, and you'd rather not be in that situation that we've all been in, where like, oh, like that didn't copy over. But yeah.
So from there, let's real quick, let's go to what a sequence looks like and maybe talk about like, it is pretty, but all of those colors have meaning, right?
Oh, absolutely. So here's the timeline again. I'll actually pull up an early timeline of this. So this is the whole film. I also have like little bins for each sequence while I'm cutting it. Let me just pull this up real quick. Again, you might not be able to read the text on it, but this is from the very beginning, like of a version 0 of the scene. And every time I make like a change, I'll like subsequence out to keep an archive and jot notes and keep track of stuff, so that invariably you'll go off the rails on something and the director will be like, hey, let's go back to this old version. And if you're not keeping track of it, you know, I mean, likely you'll be able to recreate it if you really knew what you were doing, but like maybe it was like something that took a long time to figure out. And it's much easier to just be able to cut it back in from an archive. So like an early sequence for me would look more like this. You know, so I have this main big, it might just look like a cyan blob in the center that's kind of chunkier than the rest, is going to be my picture. And so that's what you're seeing there, displayed in the upper right. And then below that, below this gray bar, is going to be my production dialogue. I'm in the habit of doing what's called checkerboarding, where you'll see that there's some on this audio track 1 and some on audio track 2. There's only really 2 characters in this film. So the audio track will come in as one continuous line, but I'll actually cut and move the primary character to one track and the secondary character to a second track, so I can replace dialogue more quickly and kind of see what's going on a little more easily.
And right there, I'll drop a note that even organizing your timeline layers is important. So if you go in and eventually, like you saw that other timeline, there's going to be music, there's going to be Foley, which is, you know, added sound effects. There could be dialogue from several people. There's room tone, which is to fill the gaps between dialogue. And all of that starts to get really big. And if you're watching it and you're like, what is that noise? I can't figure it out. You don't want to have to dig through all of those layers. You want to say like, okay, well, if I mute this, I know I'm muting the dialogue from this character. If I mute this, it's the song. And so just keeping that consistent through the entire project is very important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially when you hand it off. Eventually, if you're working with an external sound mixer, that's how they're going to want you to have organized it. I mean, they're going to have like way deeper, more detailed and dynamite organization on their end. But like, if you can at least separate it out into what's called like DME stems, dialogue, music, and effects, you know, you're gonna be on their good side. So you can see here, like this is my dialogue. These are my effects. It's kind of broken up here into 2 different groupings of effects. Just kind of more traditional sound effects and then background effects, which would be more like your room tones or like crickets in the background. And then here I have music. So this music track at one point had what's called temp music, where I actually have a library of like other film scores, and I would cut that in, which was represented in that other timeline, wherever that went. But this is actually from the composer directly. So I'll cut whenever the composer is doing stuff, even though I'm not changing the edit anymore. I'll cut that stuff in my timeline as well, just to have kind of a living, breathing document here. So that's kind of like how I break down my audio. These big, long stretches are from the sound mixer. So this is, again, like way late stage. They send stuff back to me. So I'll have the dialogue, effects, backgrounds, music separated out like I sent it off to them. And then at the very bottom is just an entire full mix of the film, so that I can export like a 5.1 or stereo mix from that. Above this, there's going to be my picture, and I separate that out as well in a similar way from like base picture that I'm not changing much to like things I'm doing visual effects treatments on, or the visual effects that come back to me, or that I'm producing myself. This is going to be something that came back from the colorist, this kind of red layer. And we ended up jumping back into this film after it was fully mixed and fully colored, because it was 20 minutes long. And while me and the director and everyone else like really enjoyed it, it just wasn't like, we just felt like maybe we could squeeze a little more runtime out of it. And so we jumped back in, tightened it up a little bit more. So you can see like, that's why there's a bunch of edits in what I got back from the colorist. This film's also in Mandarin, so it was very heavily subtitled. So I have an entire track just dedicated to my subtitles. And then at the very top is going to be what was eventually printed with subtitles burned in. But you can imagine everything below it is included. So I could just export the top track and the very bottom track, and like that's the entire film, and all the other little decisions within it don't matter, like have been rectified by that point.
So, and while before we get more technical, everyone can sort of look up tutorials how to do a lot of this stuff, because it is really extensive. So maybe let's just kind of take it to some basics, and if you can zoom way in, maybe just talk about L and J cuts for people who don't know what that is and how important that is to a film.
Yeah, so so the term L and J cut are kind of funny to me, because talking about film editing is like really challenging, it turns out. And there's not like L and J cut kind of stand above, head and shoulders above everything else in like terms of like what like editing terminology. So an L cut and a J cut, imagine here on this timeline, you see how there's this clip, I'm going to mark it. Hopefully you'll be able to notice it's kind of a different color blue now. How the audio beneath this is going to travel underneath the next shot, like the letter L in kind of a way. So this is, you've seen it a million times in movies. It's like someone's talking, and like towards the end of their dialogue, you'll start showing the next person. It's kind of like a tectonic plate subducting underneath another piece of picture. A big reason, I'll get into the reasons to do that later in a second. A J cut is the opposite, where, let's see if we can find a good J cut, where you'll start hearing, like here, you'll actually start hearing this audio before you start seeing the picture. And to me, that they do very, very, very different things, but they're both in the realm of like trying to keep the audience's attention, essentially. Because if you just have what's called straight cuts, where like the picture and the audio are completely aligned, you'll cut to the person, you'll show them talking, and cut to the next person, show them talking, and like they've actually done studies where like storytellers will be telling stories, and like the brainwave patterns of the audience listening actually gets ahead of the storyteller. And that's what's happening whenever you just do straight cuts, is like your audience is getting ahead of you, because not that your story's not clever, but they're participating. And if they're really like jamming together, like they're gonna get ahead of you eventually if you don't figure out ways to like move it along. So to me, like an L cut is if, say, like someone's saying something and it's very easy to understand and it's not necessarily important to show them saying the whole thing, you might want to cut to someone else's reaction, hearing it, and like taking on that information as they're speaking it. And a J cut might be if, like there's a lot of reasons to do it, but one would be, I like to think of it as like maybe it's something that's unexpected, or like cutting to it might feel really harsh because it's like it feels kind of random, like, oh, this person just walked in this room, and like you're not expecting the person and you don't want it to be sudden. So maybe you hear them walking in, or you hear the door open, and then you show them. That's not with dialogue, but it's still kind of a J cut, because you get to hear it before you see it. And so it kind of imitates, at least to me, like the audience is turning their head, you know? And so it's like, oh, like, who's that one? walking through, and it's like a J cut. The editor, Walter Murch, is very prolific in his ability to speak about these kinds of things. And his line is like that you always cut on like the third footstep when someone's walking through. And I noticed it for myself actually once. I was like sitting outside of a coffee shop and I heard someone walking in like very loud shoes. And I turned to look and I noticed that I turned on the third footstep. Like it was like 1, 2, 3. And then by that time I was like looking to see like what, like it was like they were walking in stirrups. But yeah, so like a J cut and L cut, like it's just part of like a larger system of like trying to make sure that like where the audience is and they're not ahead of you if you don't want them to be. You might want them to be ahead of you.
And just to explain J cut and L cut, they're called that, like there's an L or a J just because of the shape of the edit once you see on the timeline.
Yeah.
So it's not like some crazy made up technical thing like so many things in our industry are.
Yeah, right. It actually represents the shape.
Yeah. And also, it's, as a beginning filmmaker, you're prone to do that straight cut. You're just lining up a clip, it butts up to the next clip. But once you start having the overlapping video and audio, anything you watch, just pay attention to the editing, who's talking, who's listening. It's going to really affect how you're editing your own film.
I would like to add real quick though, if we have in support of the straight cut, I've gone overboard on J cuts.
Even will you unshare your screen just so we can see what you're saying?
Let's see, stop share. In support of the straight cut, I've definitely cut projects before where we needed to go faster, and I J cut and L cut like the whole scene, and it kind of makes you feel like your head's on a swivel and like you just don't know where you're looking at any point. So there is a lot of strength in a straight cut. Like the rule of thumb I like to go by, the rule I like to go by is like a 3-frame buffer on either side of the dialogue sometimes, or maybe 8 frames. It gives it a different feeling, but it allows the filmmaker to like have like a hand, like, oh, this is important to see this person start talking. Like they are important because of that. Because if you were to J cut them, it kind of diminishes their importance in the scene. And to see someone finish a line can be critical to like the impact of the statement or like a joke. Like you don't want to L cut a punchline. You might want to cut it really, really tight to keep it snappy. But like if that word at the end of the joke is the joke, like gotta show it. So it's really like a mix. But right, like you don't want to have all straight cuts, but you also don't want to all J and L, because then it'll feel weird in a different way that might be hard to pin down, because it will be smooth and it will move well, but it might not be the best. So
while we still have time, I have a couple of things I want to discuss that are, I think, the most important before we lose people is the most important thing you can do with your edited film is show somebody and be ready to have it ripped apart, right? You can be in love with it and you've been the only person, you could be in a room for a month staring at it, but you don't know what it feels like until you've shown it to a group of people, especially someone who doesn't know you, because your friends can mostly be kind of like, oh, it was cute, or it looks great, or anything. Can you speak just a little bit about how important input is with your edit? And even as you go, and we haven't mentioned this, like string out 1, string out 2, edit, fine cut, just kind of buzz through that a little bit.
Yeah, so in general, the concept of notes, one, the biggest thing to keep in mind is you have to keep your ego at the door. It's about the work, it's not about you. And the instant you make it about you and like they're tearing you apart, you're gonna lose control of the project, because you won't be able to hear the good ideas and you won't be able to sort between the good ideas and the bad ideas. So typically in the process, you'll have your own cut that you're working on alone by yourself often, and then you'll show the director, and then you'll work with the director for a certain amount of time, and like they'll tear it apart. And it sometimes feels like a swinging pendulum of like good ideas and ideas that don't work out. But as the editor, you really need to be a safe space for notes, and you want to be able to be a person that people can tell crazy ideas to, and be able to help sort through like what's the good idea in there that really works. And because nobody's going to come to you with a note or a thought that like isn't based in something true to them. It might not be applicable to this film, but like that is a person's reaction, and that person's reaction is true to them. And so it's really like a messy situation, but in a way, but like you need to be that person that's like strong and like kind of firm in your ability to like take those notes and hear them through. And like, again, not if, I mean, sometimes you have to go and take a walk around the block, but it's really not about you. And one other thing I want to add to that though is before you show somebody something that you know they're going to tear apart, watch the whole thing back yourself, because there might be something that's like really silly that you forgot to fix, that you forgot that in there that they'll note. So just make sure that you watch it back yourself. It's more difficult when it's a feature and you have to do that before sending it off, but you still got to do it. Yeah, but that's really like, that's a whole art in and of itself takes like years and years to like master. But I think if you can focus on just, again, not taking it personally and starting from there, it's the best.
Well, and some good advice on that is, as a filmmaker, you're not going to be able to sit in the theater and explain your movie to people. So if you're like, well, no, see that happened because of this, or well, that's his dad, or whatever. Like you're not gonna be able to do that. It has to stand on its own. So if you screen it to a group of people, don't defend your movie. You just take notes. You can't explain it. You're not going to be there to explain it in the theater, or if it's on Amazon or wherever you get it. So don't explain it to your friends. Maybe have a discussion of how you could tell the story better, or what's missing and what would help them understand it better. But don't get defensive, no matter how wrong your friends might be.
Yeah, because you'll see those same notes like in reviews. And like I've worked on projects before where like there were notes that like whether we chose not to address it or fix it, weren't able to for budgetary reasons or any number of other reasons, where like, like watching the process, like I've read reviews of projects I've worked on where I'm like, yep, we know, like we read that in previews, or like we just weren't able to, we didn't have the money to fix it, and we were just kind of fingers crossed it wasn't going to be a big deal. But if you can address it, try it, because we're not cutting with film anymore. It's all digital. It's free to make an alternate version and try something out. And if I like to pretend that I live by this, but like the best idea wins. And as an editor, you need to have a small enough ego to just recognize like, oh, the better idea. If it's better for the film, like it's your job to cut it in. So.
Right. Well, and here's another thing. Most of these filmmakers that do the short films will probably be editing their own project, which I think is dangerous, because you can have it playing in your head and just cut directly like that, which can be good and bad. But I think having someone else with a clean mind to take that footage and try to put it together, even if the director's edit would be good, an editor might give you an entirely new idea. Like, let's say it used to be chronological. Well, like, what if it's mixed up and there's flashbacks now, and just have a separate brain on it, and the director just take a minute away from it. And then that kind of plays into how much art is in the editor's job, and how much of it is just being a hand for the director. I know that's kind of a lot, but is there a way you can talk about that?
Yeah. No, definitely a lot to, you could do a whole seminar on just like the director-editor relationship, but it is, in a lot of ways unique. I like to view myself as a craftsman or an artisan, more so than an artist. And largely because like I view my job as very responsive, very technical in a lot of respects, and very much like a deep collaborator. And that like my job can't exist in a vacuum. I think directors should absolutely edit their own stuff, especially early on, so they understand what like the power of what's happening there. Some of my favorite movies right now actually are like, David Lowery is a fantastic director editor. Like it's a thing. the benefit to me of having an external editor is like what you were saying about that external mind, but someone else to like bounce things off of, and someone to help take the weight off of you, because directing is an incredibly difficult job, and it's like emotionally taxing to be that lodestone and that like kind of like divining rod for the entire project. And if you can find a person that can help you bear that weight, it will allow you to be a better director, because you'll be able to focus on the bigger things and really see what's missing, and not rely as much on other people to tell you what's missing. Because I don't know, it's just every step of the way you need teammates, because making a film, there's no such thing as a small project. Short films are massive undertakings. But I do think directors cutting their own stuff is especially great, but incredibly challenging. And you definitely would want to enlist like a really strong producer that you trust, or someone like a collaborator that you trust to kind of be that proxy for what the editor would be helping you with, even if you're cutting it yourself.
Right. And so let's say, just kind of fast forward to the end here.
Yeah.
So you have the edit of your film, and you just have to make sure that you know what format you need to output it as. And we don't have to go into that, but
Yeah.
there are a lot of ways to export your film. So don't just say, well, I exported it and then hand it in. Most film festivals, including Film Prize, will give you a specific type of file they need to screen. And the good thing is, with the internet, you can find a tutorial about just about anything, which is why we don't get in the weeds with your timeline or sequence or anything, because people can go out and just find out how to do the technical stuff. I think the psychology of editing is way more important to people who are just starting out, and people even who are experienced that just kind of get set in their ways. There's a lot of tips that they can take moving forward too. So I think we're about to wrap up here. Is there anything you feel like we missed? At least we got something from the chat here.
Yeah, while you're looking through that, the
Yeah.
one you mentioned, just psychology, kind of my hobby reading has delved into like books on cognitive psychology. I think it's like a real great adjacent discipline to film editing, because, and actually cognitive psychologists, I've read this somewhere, like actually look towards filmmakers as kind of like the vanguards of their discipline. And they're like, oh, filmmakers are doing things that cognitive psychologists are trying to explain. Like filmmakers just know, like you intuitively experiment or like figure it out, but filmmakers don't know what they're doing, like from a scientific standpoint necessarily. But anyways, so to me, like if you want to read like interesting books that are relevant to film editing that aren't film books, cognitive psychology.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
there are so many levels of psychology and art forms to filmmaking. It's a little endless. So in the chat here, we're going to address what advice you would give to keep the anxiety down when it comes to, like, let's say you have all of your footage, where do you even start? And maybe that's a good place to guide or two, is like, where do you start when it's just a mass of footage?
Yeah, that I think impacts everybody. So you're not alone. Like a side thing to do is like definitely keep track of your caffeine intake. I can get into a bad habit of like drinking too much coffee because I gotta do it. But like, depending on your body, that might not be the best thing. Contain the chaos.
Let's say you're making a short film for Film Prize and you're a director at home. It's just you and your footage, and you have till July 12th to turn something in.
Yeah.
What is a good way to approach that, as far as not being intimidated? Would that be like start with one scene and don't think about the entire thing?
Yeah. So this is where like your preparation is going to come in handy, and like and the thinking ahead and making these breakdowns of your script. So when you open up a scene, you can reference back to your breakdown. And the film's only going to play at 24 frames per second, like at any point. And so just like take it like a scene at a time, a clip at a time, like keep doing prep work. Like even if you're like making selects or like you're making small cuts, like, or sometimes like I'll just like make a cut. Like there's a scene and like, oh, I love this shot and I want to follow it up with another shot, but it's a massive dialogue scene. I'll sometimes just jump to there and just do that. So I have a cut in this, and like I've already made a cut in the scene. Okay, like I broke that seal. But like you got to just break it up and chunk it out. And it is a lot, but like that's really where your organization on the front end is going to help you. Like I like to use the word emulsify because to me it's like you're like dissolving it. But I mean it's a real challenge.
Here's something you can do as maybe as a novice
Yeah.
to quell that is to like make a new sequence or timeline for each scene. Even if that scene is one shot, it could be an establishing shot. Scene 2, wide of house, that's its own sequence. And then as you start putting those together, you can make a timeline where you start copying and pasting that stuff into the overall movie, and your movie slowly forms. It doesn't have to necessarily be in order. Because if you just have one timeline, and especially if you're doing a feature film, if you're trying to edit 90 minutes, that timeline is it's easy to mess it up too, because things might start to slide or overlap. So breaking it into digestible pieces, I think, is one way to kill that anxiety. And also I would say, don't wait to the last minute, because your brain starts to compensate for things that you're doing, especially color correction. And I don't know how many of you are going to be doing color, but if you're doing color correction for say a couple hours and you've made something, you think it's the perfect shade of blue, like, oh, this looks like a nice daytime hue, and you've been sitting there for a while, if you get up and walk around and come back, it's going to be wrong. Like I almost guarantee, because your eyes have adjusted and they've compensated for that color, and it'll look different when you come back. And I think that's the same way when it comes to timing with editing. Just make sure you take breaks. You can't just sit there and like, oh, I'm just going to edit these last 2 days. I don't know if Steven agrees with me, but that's just where
No, I absolutely do. I was just like reading the actual the full text of the question again, because yeah, absolutely, like working in those like bite-sized pieces. Like I cut every scene individually first before, like, and I'll do like multiple versions. And I'm trying to think of like really like that the core idea of like this anxiety, and like, and I think I feel it every day. And I think one of the things I do is like I'll have like a chunk of scenes and maybe they don't work, but like I'll sit down, like step away, like take my hands off the keyboard and hit play and like don't stop it. And just like force yourself to like experience the bad version of your cut, and it's like, yep, that sucked, like, and it's fine, because it's a process. And like, if you can, but like you've also cut a version of that scene, and when you're editing, like if you can look at something you cut and be like, man, that was bad, like that's great, because that means that you're calibrated to what you want and make notes of what you want. And like that's a huge step of like just making those initial cuts and those initial scenes, however small. Like, yeah, like Rob was saying, like even if it's scene 12 is an establishing shot, pick your favorite establishing shot, pick 3 of them, like, but you cut that scene, and you can, it's like an easy victory. But yeah, I don't know if the person who made the chat wanted to clarify a little more of what that kind of anxiety that they're feeling. But
yeah, Taylor, I hopefully that covered it. I think we both kind of went back and forth on it, but I know it is very intimidating, just like sitting down with a blank page while writing.
Yeah, oh, that's worse.
Right. So I think the last thing we'll talk about before wrapping it up here is just don't be afraid to get rid of your favorite thing in the movie. Your friends may watch it and say, this scene doesn't make sense, but it has like your favorite shot or your favorite lines or something like that. It just, if it's not working for other people, don't be afraid to get rid of it, no matter how much it hurts.
Yeah, that's something that go back and forth on a lot, right? Because it's like it takes a long time to figure out like what that feeling really is of like that thing that really needs to go. And again, back to like a point we were making earlier, like it's easy to take it out and show people it with it out, and it might be missing something, like some like that I think that's like great advice, because it's a really radical concept to like take out your favorite thing. And you might find that like, oh man, like that's my favorite shot, but like it doesn't really add anything and it actually makes the movie go faster. Or you might find like on the short film that I had pulled up a second ago, there were several things that were kind of like could maybe be considered that. And we tried cutting them all out. And some of them stayed out. Some of them were put back in because, oh, this piece of improv really encapsulated something in the film that wasn't there. But it kind of didn't fit, or we thought it didn't fit, but then we realized when we took it out that, like, man, the movie's actually really missing that, and that actor really brought something new to it. Whereas those other things that were always intended, that something else in the film did the work that already did, and we loved it. But like, let's take that line out or something like that. And it takes a while to calibrate. Some people, I mean, it took me a while to calibrate to what that felt like, but it, again, to me, is just like, watch it over again. Luckily, if you're on a short, like, it doesn't take long to watch it, and show it to other people, which that's a little tricky because you'll run out of friends who haven't seen it. And it's kind of like, so that's a whole nother thing, but
specifically for Film Prize, I will say, just because you can make a 15-minute short doesn't mean it should be 15 minutes. If you need it for your story, great. But when you show 20 films, and if they're all 14:59 or 15 minutes on the dot, you can also exhaust an audience. And when you're showing a bunch of short films together, which is most festivals, it's just use the length of the film you feel tells your story the best. You can make it between 5 and 15. If your short is the best version of itself at 5 minutes, go for it. Just because it's gonna be 15 doesn't mean it should be. And once you get outside of Film Prize too, a short film is considered up until like 40 minutes, or is it 35 or something? I'm not even sure what the cutoff is, but and yeah, show it to people and feel if they're getting uncomfortable with the length. But yeah, we have sort of beat that over the head. Well, thank you, Stephen, so much for sharing your information tonight. Hopefully it helped people. I think the anxiety question was amazing because again, we're just getting into the psychology of the whole thing. If you haven't signed up for Film Prize, go to prizefest.com. And tonight you can use, well, it's not even just tonight, it's going forward the next couple of weeks, use FP University, all caps, and you get 50% off registration. And I think that about covers it. Any questions, go ahead and email me, rob@prize.foundation, and I'll be happy to help you any way I can, or even connect you to Stephen if you have editing questions. He seems like a nice guy.
Maybe. But yeah, thank you for having me, Rob, and everybody, really best of luck as you kind of go towards these final deadlines. It's terrifying, but you'll make it.
Thanks, everybody, and look for the next class next month. Good night.